The Amish are known for a timeless lifestyle that shuns most modern conveniences. They live in close harmony with the land, raising their own animals, cows, pigs, and chickens, and growing fresh produce in greenhouses. Their culinary repertoire includes many dishes familiar to a modern metropolitan household. Yet, what truly sets their food preparation apart is how they preserve beef, pork, and chicken without electric refrigeration. While some more lenient Amish groups may use gas-powered refrigerators, many communities rely on age-old methods that not only keep their meat fresh, but also enhance its flavor over time. Number 1. The role of salting and brining. They select non-iodized salt that remains free of chemical agents, ensuring that the natural taste of the meat remains undisturbed and allowing for more predictable results. They often prefer coarser varieties, as finer grains dissolve too rapidly, potentially altering the intended strength of the solution. They may even sift their salt beforehand to maintain uniform crystal size. Before adding salt to water, they sometimes strain and filter their well-drawn water through tightly woven cloth to remove sediment, resulting in a brine that remains clear and stable throughout the entire soaking period. They rely on consistently cool ambient temperatures that do not fluctuate wildly, as sudden changes could compromise the even distribution of salt within the meat's internal structures. They never rely solely on time. They observe subtle cues in the meat's appearance and texture, sometimes examining cross-sections to see how deeply the salt has penetrated. Rather than simply placing meat in a static solution, they gently agitate or stir the brine at intervals, ensuring that no portion of the cut remains in a less saline zone. This careful circulation allows for a steady balance in salt concentration around the meat, minimizing uneven curing. They avoid metal containers that can react with salt and prefer large, inert vessels made of glass, ceramic, or well-seasoned wood. These containers do not leach unwanted flavors and help maintain the chosen salinity level throughout the process. They occasionally measure salinity by floating an object of known density or by using rudimentary hydrometers, ensuring the solution remains consistently strong. If the solution weakens, they add measured amounts of salt and gently swirl until it dissolves completely. If conditions become too humid, they might store their salt supply in cloth bags hung high and away from any moisture sources, preventing clumping or contamination. They understand that different muscle groups absorb salt at varying rates, and they adjust their approach accordingly, sometimes trimming excess fat beforehand to ensure the solution moves unimpeded into the leaner tissues. They minimize handling the meat during brining to reduce contamination risk, and when they must handle it, they wash their hands with fragrance-free soap that doesn't influence taste. They take care that the water used for each new batch of brine is consistently pure, often drawn from the same well. After reaching their target infiltration, they never reuse the old brine. Instead, they discard it and prepare a fresh solution for the next cuts, maintaining a hygienic environment free from microbial buildup. Number 2, dry salting and handling. They choose salt with uniform crystal size and no synthetic additives, often sourced from suppliers who guarantee consistent mineral profiles. They lay cuts on elevated wooden racks that facilitate airflow beneath and around the meat. They rotate the slabs periodically, ensuring that salt contacts every surface evenly and that moisture drawn out by the salt can drip away freely rather than pooling. They press the salt firmly into the flesh instead of just sprinkling it, achieving a denser layer that clings more effectively. They avoid using metal tools during this phase, preferring wooden paddles or flat wooden spoons to prevent metallic tastes or chemical reactions. They monitor the texture of the meat with their fingertips, feeling for any slight stickiness that would suggest insufficient salt penetration. When necessary, They apply additional salt to thicker areas that require deeper penetration, ensuring no portion remains undercured. They remain attentive to environmental conditions, adjusting the timing slightly when humidity rises or when the ambient temperature fluctuates. If the weather turns unexpectedly warm, they may choose a spot deeper inside a cool pantry or behind thick stone walls that moderate temperature swings. They also occasionally brush off excess salt if it accumulates unevenly, then reapply a fresh layer, maintaining a uniform salinity that fosters consistent preservation. They inspect the meat's surface color periodically. A uniform, duller tone indicates the salt is doing its job removing moisture evenly. Any patchiness could signal uneven salt distribution, prompting careful resalting or repositioning of the slab. They never rush the process. They understand that rushing could lead to insufficient moisture removal, resulting in less stable preservation. Instead, they give the meat the required time to lose enough water content to create conditions unfavorable for bacterial growth. They know that the tactile feedback, the feel of the meat's surface, the firmness under gentle pressure, provides valuable clues about the salt's progress. They often store their salted cuts away from strong odors that could infiltrate the surface. They sometimes wrap the salted meat loosely in breathable cloth, not to trap moisture, but to deter insects or dust, all without hindering evaporation. They recognize that each cut has its own characteristics: fat distribution, muscle density, and overall thickness, and they tailor their salt application accordingly. They keep meticulous mental notes about what worked best for certain sizes and shapes, refining their approach over time and passing this knowledge through generations without relying on written guides. Number 3, root cellars as natural refrigerators. They choose construction sites where soil composition naturally moderates temperature shifts. They shape the interior to maximize air circulation without letting in too much external heat. They build staggered shelves at varying heights, placing heavier cuts below where denser air collects, and leaner pieces above where conditions differ slightly. They sometimes line walls with layers of straw beneath wooden boards to balance humidity, adjusting thickness based on seasonal rainfall patterns. They include shallow gravel trenches beneath the floor to channel excess moisture away, keeping the environment from becoming too damp. They carve discrete ventilation channels near the upper sections, controlling airflow with simple wooden shutters that can be opened or closed according to the weather. They ensure shelves are made from wood untreated with chemicals, keeping odors neutral. They occasionally coat surfaces with thin layers of beeswax to repel moisture and discourage mold formation. They place small clay containers filled with charcoal in corners to absorb off odors and maintain a fresher atmosphere. They position burlap sacks stuffed with dried leaves near entryways, adding another subtle buffer against temperature swings. They avoid direct sunlight at all costs, so the single entrance often includes a slight bend or narrow corridor that prevents daylight from penetrating deeply. They group meats by type in separate zones, preventing cross flavors from developing. They periodically rearrange the positioning of certain cuts, ensuring each piece experiences an even exposure to stable conditions. They use no artificial lighting, relying on oil lamps placed briefly at checkups, never leaving them lit inside for extended periods. They rest thermally sensitive containers filled with water in strategic corners, observing how quickly that water changes temperature to gauge minor fluctuations. They sometimes place a handful of carefully chosen dried herbs suspended in small cloth pouches. These herbs emit subtle compounds that help maintain a clean aroma. They never overcrowd the space. They keep pathways clear so air can circulate without obstruction. They monitor the cellar quietly, sometimes even listening for subtle dripping sounds that might indicate a hidden moisture pocket. They mark the most reliable storage spots based on past success and pass these details to others who learn to identify the subtle cues of stable conditions. They refrain from unnecessary openings. Each visit is purposeful. They note even minor shifts in smell or texture, adjusting their insulation or opening vents slightly to restore equilibrium. They know that slight modifications made patiently over time yield consistently favorable conditions. Number 4, smoking meat for preservation and flavor. They adjust the structure's vents and shutters to guide airflow so that smoke envelops each piece evenly without stagnating. They position each cut at specific heights, selecting spots where the smoke's density remains consistent. They prefer logs seasoned for months in covered storage, ensuring their moisture content is low enough to release mellow aromas rather than sharp, bitter tones. They trim away bark that might produce harsh flavors, focusing on heartwood that smolders more steadily. They occasionally sprinkle a handful of clean, dry sawdust from the same wood type onto the embers, creating gentle bursts of fragrant vapor without raising the temperature abruptly. They watch the hue of the smoke closely. Pale blue wisps signal a cleaner burn than thick, grayish plumes. They rely on subtle sensory feedback, sniffing lightly near the smokehouse's upper gaps to detect changes in aroma that might suggest too rapid combustion. They add or remove small wedges of fuel to maintain stable conditions, never letting the chamber heat surge or dip erratically. They may shift cuts slightly if one side appears to deepen in color too fast, balancing exposure to avoid an overly concentrated smoky crust on any single area. They keep simple wooden paddles handy to stir embers, redistributing them for more uniform heat release. They might gently fan the entrance with a woven mat if air becomes too still. They occasionally place shallow clay bowls filled with clean water in corners to keep humidity balanced. They believe that a balanced moisture level enhances the penetration of aromatic compounds into muscle fibers without creating sogginess. They avoid resins or coniferous branches that impart sharp, unwanted notes. They never load too much fuel at once. Smaller increments of wood maintain steadier conditions and prevent sudden spikes in smoke thickness. They remain patient, checking progress by feel and sight, rather than relying on timers. They note the subtle deepening of surface color and the gradual firming of the texture. They trust past experience, but also adapt continuously, making minor adjustments to wood size or positioning to refine each batch's outcome. They understand that smoke interacts with the meat's proteins and fats on a molecular level, creating preservative compounds and distinct layers of flavor complexity. Over time, each subtle tweak becomes part of their living knowledge base, ensuring their smoked products remain consistently prized. Number 5, canning for long-term convenience. They carefully inspect jars for tiny cracks before beginning, rejecting any that show the smallest defect. They choose lids lined with food-safe sealing compounds that remain stable under prolonged heat. They measure headspace precisely, often leaving about 1 inch of empty space at the top to ensure proper vacuum formation. They immerse jars completely in the canner's water bath or place them on the rack inside the pressure vessel, making sure each jar sits upright and spaced so steam or boiling water can circulate evenly. They maintain a steady heat source, watching carefully as small bubbles escape from under the lids, confirming that air is being driven out to create a stable vacuum once cooled. They do not rely solely on time. They check how the meat's texture changes during the heating process. They might prick a piece before packing to see if juices run clear, confirming thorough cooking. They ensure no large air pockets remain trapped inside the jars by gently tapping or stirring with clean wooden utensils. They strain excess fat before packing, since too much grease can hinder proper sealing. They add a modest amount of heated broth or water to keep cuts moist without diluting flavor too much. They verify that their canner's pressure gauges read accurately, calibrating them periodically against a known standard. If at higher altitudes, they adjust processing time slightly, fully aware that lower atmospheric pressure affects boiling points. They wait patiently after processing, removing jars only when internal pressure stabilizes. They avoid jostling the jars right after removal, letting them rest undisturbed so the vacuum seal can set firmly. They listen for the faint ping of lids sealing as they cool. They test the seal by lightly pressing the center of the lid. A secure seal resists any give. They label each jar with the exact date and type of meat. They store finished jars in low-light conditions, often on sturdy wooden shelves away from sources of vibration. They keep consistent track of their inventory, using older jars first and rotating stock so nothing remains too long. If ever a jar seal loosens or the contents appear cloudy, they discard it rather than risk consumption. They trust these carefully monitored methods to deliver safe, flavorful results well into the colder seasons. Number 6. Sugar and vinegar cures. They evaluate each sweetener's moisture content before mixing it with salt, ensuring a granular texture that clings evenly to the surface. They sometimes layer different sweeteners, beginning with a base of finely milled dried fruit sugar, followed by small crystals of evaporated cane juice to achieve a spectrum of sweetness that gradually permeates deeper layers. They may lightly roast certain sugar sources beforehand to intensify their fragrance, carefully controlling temperature to avoid caramelization that could lead to bitter notes. They experiment with dissolving a portion of the sugar in warm, purified water, creating a sticky glaze brushed on thicker cuts to promote faster penetration. They consider the kind of vinegar meticulously. They don't limit themselves to a single variety. They may rotate between delicate apple cider vinegar, a slightly sharper white vinegar, or even a mild wine vinegar to adjust the meat's eventual flavor profile. They gauge acidity levels, sometimes using simple pH strips, to confirm that the solution reaches a targeted range. They adjust sugar to vinegar ratios based on the thickness of the muscle fibers, knowing that denser sections benefit from longer exposure to slightly more acidic mixtures. They occasionally incorporate a pinch of finely ground mustard seed or a mild allspice note dissolved into the vinegar solution, enhancing complexity without overshadowing the core flavors. They stir their vinegar brines frequently, preventing layers of concentrated acid from settling at the bottom. They soak cuts in earthenware vessels that absorb some moisture and help regulate temperature. They sometimes add a thin layer of sugar on top of the meat mid-process, allowing it to slowly dissolve as the vinegar solution circulates. They use carefully chosen cloth filters that let the meat's surface breathe while catching any undissolved sugar crystals drifting through the brine. They watch for subtle color changes in the fibers. A slight darkening can indicate that the vinegar's mild acidity is working effectively, while a silkier surface texture suggests sugar molecules have begun to bond with proteins, sealing in flavor. They track how quickly the meat firms at the edges, interpreting it as a sign of progressing preservation. They gently pat the surface dry after removal, never rinsing, to preserve the subtle sweetness and gentle tang. They store the finished pieces in quiet, low-odor environments to prevent interference with the newly established flavor balance, confident that these sugar and vinegar applications yield a distinctive sensory depth unlike any other curing method. Number 7. Seasonal methods. Sun drying and winter freezing. They position racks at specific angles so sunlight falls directly and consistently across each cut surface, ensuring no piece remains in partial shade. They suspend thin strips rather than thick slabs, maximizing evaporation by increasing exposed surface area. They sometimes stretch lightweight cloth screens over the racks, filtering out insects without blocking airflow. They measure humidity levels with simple homemade devices, adjusting their timing if the air grows too damp. They turn each piece periodically, ensuring even drying on all sides, and test progress by gently pressing the meat's surface to detect subtle firmness. They note patterns. If morning mists linger too long, they shift racks to higher ground, where breezes disperse moisture more quickly. They avoid placing racks near blooming plants that might attract insects or add extraneous odors. They consider the altitude of their drying location, knowing that thinner air aids dehydration. They may slightly alter slicing thickness based on how intense midday heat proves, keeping the process efficient. They keep the drying area meticulously clean, sweeping away dust and debris to prevent any gritty texture forming on the meat's exterior. They sometimes scatter a thin layer of crushed, dried herbs beneath the racks, believing that their mild scents help discourage flies without affecting the meat's neutral aroma. They store any completed batches away from light immediately, ensuring the dried texture remains stable until needed. When temperatures plunge, they shift strategies. They hang heavier cuts high above ground, relying on consistently cold, stable winter air. They select spots shielded from direct sunlight, since fluctuating daytime warmth might cause partial thawing. They anticipate wind patterns, ensuring cold drafts pass evenly around the meat, freezing it uniformly throughout its thickness. They sometimes position snowbanks strategically to reflect faint winter light away, maintaining steady, chilled conditions. They monitor the meat's firmness by tapping gently. If the surface resists indentation, it signals that internal moisture has solidified thoroughly. They remain attentive to rare warm spells, ready to move the meat if necessary. They choose hooks crafted from materials that do not conduct heat easily, preventing localized thawing at contact points. They rarely handle the meat once it's set, minimizing any transfer of body heat that might disrupt freezing. They mark each batch with subtle notches, knowing exactly which day it began freezing, and rotate these batches in a logical sequence so no piece overstays in unpredictable weather. Over time, they refine these methods, always adjusting placement, timing, and handling to maintain consistently reliable outcomes.